Hello and welcome back to this Downput Idealistic Crusade. This video will continue my series on my ever-growing James Bond book collection, but this time I wanted to take time to talk about the all-important James Bond reference books. So this video will detail all the various books I picked up on Ian Fleming, the literary Bond, so the James Bond novels, the James Bond phenomenon, James Bond in popular culture, some critical works, and of course all the books about the films, which vastly outnumber pretty much everything else combined. But I do have some interesting volumes. Unfortunately, I don't have everything. I've read many books on Bond from libraries. If there is a book on Bond or with Bond in it as a substantial amount of the page count, I have to read it. Just that's how my head works. And I've read a great many of the critical theory Bond books, the science of James Bond, various things like that. I just don't have a physical copy of those. And some, I didn't really feel that I needed them. Unfortunately, with most Bond books, there is a lot of regurgitation of the same things over and over. So it's very rare for me to find a Bond book that I'm very happy with, because most of the time I feel I've already, I know everything in there already. There's nothing new for me to cover, and again, most of the stuff is already contained in a lot of the key texts. And of course, you look in the sources list of most books, they will be, dead center in there. But I kind of got started on all of this journey and trying to learn every single factoid humanly possible about James Bond in general when I was a kid, and I was very lucky to find in a Walden Books. I still vividly remember it was a Walden Books where I found this. This is the updated edition of Stephen J. Rubin's complete James Bond movie encyclopedia, which had another version updating, and then just recently this year he published a brand new version, which I really want to check out because this has so much nostalgia for me. And of course, from the majorly pre-internet days, books like this, they were the tomes of knowledge. And so this without question, this was my childhood Bible. I pored over this, the laminates, peeling off the corner, the pages are starting to yellow a little bit. This has been well read and well loved by me. But everything you ever wanted to know up to that point in time, because this runs through GoldenEye. Again, this is the second edition. This was a godsend, and so it started me on the path. And now we have books that, of course, I wish I had growing up. If I had what is now probably the go-to tome for Bond, which is Some Kind of Hero, where you pretty much get the history of the Bond films condensed into a single rather thick volume that, of course, I wish was longer because I can't get enough. We have so many great riches in the world of Bond research and Bond scholarship that it's not only fantastic, but it's great for all Bond fans. So there's really, I hate to say there's no excuse, but there's no excuse now for people to only be passing fans. And, if they want to, basically, if fans want to know more about the films, the information is out there and is readily available. And outside of the official volumes and official documentaries and things where they're not censored or sanitized or anything, but as with anything, it is different when you hear things directly from the horse's mouth and from outside perspectives and from actual biographers and historians and scholars writing, as opposed to the official company doctrine. So it's just fantastic. All this stuff is available now, and it's not me just simply scouring forums and scouring any fan site I can find and trying to compile all kinds of stuff together and then add it to my never-ending Bond file in my head, because it's just overflowing. And so this video will be substantial. I do have far more volumes than I ever realized, and I went ahead, and so this will not just include all of my Bond reference books and film books and companions and visual guides, because they all kind of come together, and there are tons of Bond books, but it is a very small amount that is actually the cream of the crop, as it were, and actually getting into the hardcore information territory. So I will spotlight those as we go along. So I'll try to single out the particular volumes that I feel are most important, and there are a few that if you're new to this or you're just looking for specifically certain books on a subject, like what is the best Fleming book, what is the best book on the films as one volume, and then all the specialty books that are focusing on a particular subject. That's what I'll try to give a sense of that, because there are so many books with James Bond in the title or pictures of Bond films on it. But again, the vast majority are just regurgitating the same things over and over again, or doing plot synopsises, or, just, filling with jokes or the author's own interpretation, or just what they like and what they don't like, and doing ranking lists, which, you can do that yourself online any day of the week. But I do feel it is an important part of Bond in book form, and it's something that hardly ever gets discussed outside of the deepest of diehard fan circles and Bond forums. And I'm hoping that maybe this video will encourage fans to seek out some of these volumes and check out books that you maybe haven't yet. There are still so many that I haven't gotten to read yet. The notable exception for me now, I don't have a copy of the Taschen James Bond Archives, which is the fantastic, archival coffee table book that Taschen came out with a number of years ago. That was, absurdly expensive, and then they came out with a slimmed down version, but then that's gone out of print, and they've done an updated version, but that's out of print. So I think what they're doing is they're probably going to come out with another one when No Time to Die comes out. So that's why the other ones went on moratorium, and now they're like, $500 for a copy, and I'm like, I can't afford that. So that's the biggie that I don't have currently, but I'm really hoping they could come out with a new one, which I believe they're going to, so I can finally get my hands on the actual affordable Taschen copy, or I should say the version for us normal folk who can't drop a couple $100 on an art book, even though we want to very, very badly, just to salivate over it. So without further ado, let's go off and take a closer look and go in depth with my vast collection of James Bond reference material. So again, this is books on the novels, books on Fleming, books on the films, books on Bond's impact and the pop culture landscape at large, and also just because I couldn't fit it anywhere else, the handful of Bond magazines I have, and some vintage pieces with interviews, and of course even some of the guides for the various Bond video games and the Victory Games role-playing game series from the 1980s. So we'll start this by going through all of my books dealing with Ian Fleming and the literary Bond. So what better place to start than where Fleming originally started, by getting the name for the character, and then of course was American ornithologist James Bond, and the book we have here, Birds of the West Indies. Fleming was of course using a much earlier version, Field Guide to the Birds of the West Indies. This is a much later printing from about probably 2002 or so that I picked up, because of course what self-respecting Bond fan would not have some iteration of the iconic book that gave the character his name. And of course it is, extremely informative if you were looking to know more about the Birds of the West Indies. So I will admit I bought this as a kid simply because I wanted a copy of Birds of the West Indies just to have on the shelf, but I've actually leafed through it a number of times over the years. And this later edition, has these color photo inserts in the center, and really nice informative text with a lot of illustrations. And of course, it's great for bird hunting if you find yourself in Jamaica at Goldeneye, or even if you somehow found the mythical Los Organos. Next, I have two volumes on Fleming himself. The first, the 1995 Andrew Lycett biography, really needs no introduction to Bond fans, and if you have not yet read this, you really should go ahead and read it, because it's really been the go-to Bond Bible for Fleming information ever since its publication in 1995. There are a variety of books on Fleming now, but this is still most people's go-to volume. This is a later paperback edition, which still has the really nice photo section in the center. And then really interestingly, in 2015, Robert Harling published this volume, which is a personal memoir, as it's entitled, of course, of his own long-term relationship and friendship with Fleming, that really began right around the time of World War II, and then went into the age in which Fleming was becoming more and more popular and the Bond novels started taking off. This one's really interesting because, of course, you're getting a person's personal perspective, and with the passage of time as well, because, again, this was written in 2015. It's also got a really nice photo section in the center. And of course, these are just 2 volumes on Fleming. There are so many now. The problem is so many volumes now want to so strongly go with the idea that a lot of critics had that Bond was Fleming's dreamlike version of what he would have wanted himself to be, and his perfectly realized version of himself. While Fleming obviously drew on his own experiences and put some of his own personal tastes and foibles in the Bond character, I've never quite agreed with that idea that Bond was his dreamlike reflection of himself. There were many inspirations, and of course there are just as many other theories of who the Bond character may have been specifically based on. But these are 2 fantastic volumes that are really must-reads. There is a new book on Fleming that's coming out, a new biography, and there was the earlier John Pearson one, which I really would like to. I haven't read it yet, but I've been meaning to for ages. But these 2 are really essential. Next, I have a number of volumes specifically detailing the actual James Bond novels. So these are pure literary Bond related. There is nothing about the cinematic Eon Bond, and of course some background Fleming material. So to start is this rather deceptively plain looking volume, Ian Fleming's James Bond, Annotations and Chronologies for Ian Fleming's Bond Stories by John Griswold. Now, again, this seems deceptively plain, but it is rather a hefty tome, and what you get inside, instead of simply a book seemingly about the plots of the Fleming Bond novels, this is probably the single most nerdy detailing and run through of all of the various details throughout the entire Bond series in terms of Fleming's Bond. So if you ever wanted to know more about the golf game in Goldfinger, or the internal workings of MI6 as depicted in Fleming's work, or historical background, or trying to figure out exactly where Bond's flat might have been with the geographical locations of London as shown here, that is detailed in here. Everything from details about the Aston Martin DB3 that Bond drives in Goldfinger to a bit on Blades, as detailed in the opening of Moonraker. Details about the individual casino games played in each of the novels and the various moves, such as Bond hitting the roulette wheel. And it's broken down novel by novel in chronological order. And again, it seems very plain, and you're seeing this and you're just like, oh, it's a lot of text, but it is just impeccably researched and put together, and basically tells you everything you never knew you even wanted to know about details in the Ian Fleming James Bond novels. As you can see, the page count is quite substantial. We're at Diamonds Are Forever, and it's only at page 137. So this, again, runs through the entire gamut of the Fleming canon, with illustrations where necessary, which are very well appreciated. A lot of maps, geographical studies. Here's a piece on the golf balls used in the Goldfinger game, and of course a picture of Bond's Penfold Hearts ball. And then, if I'm remembering correctly, I do believe there are occasional mentions of where things might have been changed for the films, but by and large, those are fleeting. This is straight up just about the Fleming Bond canon. So this is basically an extremely nerdy, highly detailed research reference tome into the inner workings of the stories and the details of Fleming's Bond novels. So it's gotten tricky to find nowadays. I don't believe this is in print anymore. I was very lucky to find this in an independent bookstore. And it is, dimensions-wise, it is very much like some other print-on-demand fan-written reference books that I've gotten before. I have a couple volumes that are almost the exact same size and shape, but as I was saying, this is a very hefty tome. It is a soft cover, so it's very easy to pick up and read and flip to a particular page that you're looking for. So this belongs on every Bond fan shelf. It is an absolute reference work, and you can just go and pull it off the shelf and find whatever is whatever question is in your head at any time. This is really the definitive book of details on the Fleming Bond novels. Continuing on with this idea, I have two further volumes about the actual Bond novels. This first one from 1999 by the author B.S. McReynolds, called the '007 Dossier, is a much more tongue-in-cheek look at the Bond novels, but it's actually well done and with a number of rather interesting illustrations, some a little more on the cartoony side, but what makes this fun is it is written with a tongue-in-cheek, humorous approach. So it's basically a love letter to the Bond novels and a nice reference work. And you get nice little illustrations, again, kind of cartoonish, detailing the various characters from the Fleming world and various subplots and moments from the films, plus a lot of details about Bond's armaments, and then it ends with a sort of reference chart of the girls, the villains, and the plots. But it's a fun little reference book, and if you were just looking to have something on the shelf to, again, pull off as a more general book about the Fleming novels, this is a fun read. But again, I don't think this is too common either. I just stumbled across it a number of years ago, and I've never seen another copy of it. While on the other hand, this one is quite well known. This is the O.F. Snelling penned '007 James Bond: A Report, published by Signet, and the classic design of the '60s U.S. Signet paperbacks, with this nice bold red background and the author's name printed down the side as if it was to match the James Bond Thriller logo that would be on all of these. The spine is red and otherwise matches the exact design of the U.S. Signet paperbacks. And there's the rear. So this was released really at the height of Bond mania in 1965, and is essentially an entire book of, well, they're not really essays, but it's broken up into individual chapters, basically explaining the Bond allure, the importance of the novels, what makes them great, what makes them tick, what makes the literary Bond tick. And it's very interesting to have this sort of as a tie-in to the wave of Bond mania, but of course it is specifically about just the James Bond novels themselves. I saved these for last. It's two different copies of the same book. This is the book For Your Eyes Only, Ian Fleming plus James Bond by Ben McIntyre. Again, this is just the hardcover and the paperback version. This essentially is a combination of Fleming biography, history of the literary Bond, and history of the films and how all that sort of intertwines. But what's interesting is the actual novel portion, or I should say the text portion, you can get here in paperback, but here in the hardcover, it's done as more of a art or coffee table book, and it's stuffed with really high quality stills and images of the various photo stills from the films, and a lot of very highly detailed photographs of original props as well. So I had gotten this one before without realizing that the hardcover was also sort of doubling as a coffee table book. So later on I was able to pick up the hardcover version as well. Of course, wonderful design with manuscript pages here in the interior of the book. So as you can see, it's going from the origination of Bond in the Fleming world. Again, loads of beautiful stills. So if you want the full experience, you will want the hardcover version, which also, again, doubles as a nice coffee table book. But there's a lot of artifact photos, and then you get into, eventually into the films, and then you start getting stills from the films as well. Let's see if I can find there's some of Ken Adams' concept drawings, and then you start getting actual photos of original props as well. So again, the paperback doesn't have any of the great photos, but you pretty much get all of the same text. The chapters are the same. You do get a photo section in the center, which is primarily black and white, and then a second one that deals with the later history of the book and getting into the films a little bit. So again, if you just want the text version, you can get it in paperback form, but you will probably want to go ahead and get the hardcover for the whole coffee table book experience. And this is another nice volume to have if you're looking to just get a handful of books or just to start with one or two, and you're looking to learn more about the world of Fleming and his life and the literary bond. This does a pretty good balance of focusing on Fleming and then also talking about the films some, but not going overboard on the films, because most books, let's face it, are about the film series and not Fleming or the literary bond, or they're a particular take on Fleming's life and his work. So it's been a while since I've read this, but I remember it being a pretty balanced approach, and it is a nice volume if you're looking for ones to recommend. Next, we'll move on to a number of autobiographies and memoirs that I have from some key Bond team original members. This first one is Shirley Eaton's autobiography, entitled, of course, What Else? Golden Girl, with a nice foreword by Mickey Spillane, of all people. It's been a while since I've read this, but I have fond memories of getting this because I actually got this at a book signing where I was able to meet Miss Eaton, and she very kindly inscribed it to me. So it's one of the few books that I've gotten at a book signing like that. So it's got some special memories because of that. And it's been a little while since I've read this, but it was a very entertaining, fun read. And of course, outside of Goldfinger, Shirley Eaton was involved in many iconic British films throughout the 60s and 70s, and a little bit beyond as well. So I always find it rewarding. You learn, of course, so much more about people outside of the few moments on screen that you might most know them from, because of course we've all seen Goldfinger millions of times, but it's always great to get again, that's that feeling of straight from the horse's mouth, and get that original first person perspective from the original key players of those individual scenes. Next up is John Glenn's autobiography entitled For My Eyes Only, published in 2001 with a great, of course, heavy focus on his tenure in the James Bond films as second unit director, editor, and of course director of the entire 1980s series of 5 films, so basically the John Glenn era of the 1980s. I still think that Glenn is horribly underrated and undervalued, and is extremely down to earth, and so it's really rewarding every time I go back to this particular book, hearing his life story in his own words, and how he got into the film business and worked his way up, starting on essentially in his early days actually working in the sound department on, of all films, The Third Man, which of course would make me absolutely pee my pants in anxiety just to think of that. And of course, he being another of the key essential Bond personnel that actually have connections or worked on The Third Man. So I've always found that quite ironic in a number of ways. But this is an essential volume for Bond fans. If you have not read it, it is really fantastic. Most of it is like an expansion of what you hear in his comments on the DVDs and the Blu-rays for the films he directed or was involved in. So basically, if you were entertained or wanted to know more of his own viewpoints and his memories of the films, and you wanted more than what you got in the official documentary pieces and commentaries, this is a must read. And also he talks a little bit about his career post Bond, which unfortunately was not particularly the longest. It's also a number of nice production stills and personal photographs and things as well, which always helps to set the mood of individual sections. So again, there is a good bulk devoted to his Bond tenure and Bond films. And of course, as it should, it has a foreword written by Roger Moore himself. So this is one of the absolutely essential books for any and all Bond fans to have on your shelf. Next up is Alec Mills' 2014 autobiography and memoir entitled Shooting 007 and Other Celluloid Adventures, also with a foreword by Roger Moore himself. Rather nice, attractive-looking cover. A lot of reviews say this book doesn't go into enough detail But it is written in a very straightforward, matter-of-fact manner. Basically, Mill's talking about how he became fascinated with films as a child, got into the film industry, and like John Glenn's book, how he worked his way up. And basically, most of his filmography he does a section on. And then, of course, talks about all of his James Bond experiences as cameraman and, working in the first and second units, and eventually graduating to being the cinematographer of both Timothy Dalton films. And of course, I do feel he is underrated for his work on those two films. I think he's not talked about often enough. So the insight you get here, I think, is really rewarding, and also of the inner workings of the British film industry and how that relates into the British system of cinematography, which is a bit different than what we have here in the U.S. Because here in the States, the cinematographer does everything, whereas in Britain, it is primarily the practice of having the camera operator, which Mills was for a significant part of his career, setting up the shots and things, and the cinematographer being the lighting cameraman and dealing with the actual lighting of the scenes. So basically splitting the job up into two, if not multiple roles with the entire camera crew. So it's done a bit differently, and the whole British studio hierarchy was, of course, different as well. So it's fascinating getting an insider's perspective on those things. But for just dedicated Bond fans, there is good material in here, and it's always great hearing crew stories. But it's not specifically all entirely about Bond, which is, I think, what led to a lot of people not giving it very good reviews, because they were sort of going in for something else entirely. There are a number of really great photos in here as well, and it's a pretty quick read, but it's very enjoyable, and it's one of those that once I got into it, I had to finish it, and very very nicely it goes in rough chronological order as well. There's a center color photograph section on nice glossy paper with some really nice candids and on-set photos. So this is another volume I do really recommend for the absolute diehard Bond fans, because you just really can't get enough of this material, and getting it from the actual person's memory and from their own viewpoint is just ever rewarding. And of course, I had to have and discuss Roger Moore's individual volumes and memoirs that he published, starting with his first, entitled My Word is My Bond, which is just absolutely essential, and, just gives you even more the measure of the man that you know and love and adore, still to this day. And this is just such a rich, rewarding volume to come back to, and essential for Bond fans, essential for fans of Roger's tenure, but just a wonderful experience. And giving his life story, his experiences in the industry, really nice photo sections as well. There's actually two in here, so they're breaking his life and career up into several sections. And then what was great is, since this book really leaves you wanting more in the best possible way, he did write a second volume, which is beautifully entitled One Lucky Bastard. This was published a number of years later, using the iconic still with glass and cigarette that you see floating around the internet a lot of places. It did have a different cover and I believe a different title in the UK, so this is the US version with the original title. But this one is basically more anecdotes and more stories from his life and career, and is definitely a companion piece to the first volume. So if you enjoyed the first one and you haven't read his second book yet, I do absolutely recommend it. And he did write a third volume, which I haven't gotten a physical copy yet, but I really need to. And that was actually published, if I'm trying to remember correctly, but if memory serves me, I believe it was pretty close to when he actually died. So I've read it, and I've just not gotten a physical copy yet, but it also was really wonderful, and again was just more no pun intended, more stories and more anecdotes, and and bits of wisdom and so on and so forth. Also with a number of really great photos like this book has. This book, they are pretty much printed into the actual pages. There's not a photo section, but this is just another rewarding volume. And for Roger fans, there are 3 great volumes available now. Unfortunately, I don't have a physical copy of the 3rd one. What I do have is the really, truly interesting James Bond diary, which was done for the promotion of Live and Let Die. The idea being that someone somehow came up with the idea of Roger Moore's first turn in the role. Wouldn't it be cool if they could publish a nice, juicy diary to, publicize what it's like playing James Bond? So there are some things in here. It's been a little while since I've read it, but some of it was, kind of designed to be sort of a trying to think of the right way to describe it. Some things are definitely played up a bit in terms of trying to make it nice and juicy and a little bit salacious, like not quite like a tabloid magazine, but it is kind of an interesting attempt at trying to publicize the film by having the star write a quote-unquote diary. And this was only printed in 1973, really, and so you had to track down this in paperback form. But just recently, a couple years ago, they did republish it with a new introduction and foreword, and I really would like to pick that up simply to read that new material and to have it in a more modern copy, even though I was very lucky to finally get this in a very excellent condition copy, original paperback. Most of the time you find this, you do have to pay, quite a bit for an old paperback, and it's usually pretty beat up. And, it does have the illustrations in here, and as indicated on the cover, some of them are profusely illustrated, which that being on the cover always has cracked me up because it's, just saying, oh man, this is going to be really interesting because it's profusely illustrated. So now we move on to all the books I have about the film series specifically, and we'll go through in rough author order. This first one I've got because it's from a variety of authors, and it seems deceptively small. It's the Rough Guide to James Bond, and goes pretty much all the way through The Time of Die Another Day, 2002, and has sections on the films, the novels, and all the various Bond iconography. But this volume, while it's very small and only goes through 2002, if you were looking for one volume to explain the world of Bond and to have a general reference for everything up to that point, again, up till 2002, this is the book to have, actually. This has been one of my favorite little reference books to come back to. And again, don't let its size fool you. It is really well done, loaded with fantastic stills, even though the size is rather small. The text is very easy to read, and then all of the novels, all of the films are ranked according to a ranking order with really nice author bits and blurbs about each. So this also means they went through the entirety of the continuation novels up to this point. So it goes all the way through the Benson era, which you don't see many of the reference books doing. And then packed throughout are extra asides and articles about real life and real world parallels. Some are, just little cheeky, humorous articles and things. So it's done with a bit of tongue-in-cheek, which makes it much more enjoyable to read. And again, some great stills used in here. The printing is excellent. It's very easy to read, and a very quick read too, and you can always come back to it. It's very well done. It's not just your usual run-of-the-mill relisting of factoids over and over. And again, there is a whole chapter on Fleming and the development of Bond that is a really nice distillation of a lot of the history. So this gets you a lot of things in one very small, concise package. So again, if you were looking for one book, especially if you're completely new to James Bond and you're looking for one crash course, this is an excellent small crash course in the world of James Bond. Next is Nobody Does It Better, the complete, uncensored, unauthorized oral history of James Bond from the writing partner team of Mark Altman and Edward Gross, who did the absolutely excellent 50-Year Mission books on Star Trek, which are in the exact same form. They've done a number of books in this type now, and I believe they have more planned. So what this is essentially culling together interviews, both new and old, a lot of really great new ones that the authors go out and get over a number of years, and it's all put into book form and then edited into the chronological path of the subject. So this volume deals with Bond, and they do a fantastic job at getting, again, the uncensored and unauthorized oral history. So it is basically done as if you're reading a book of interviews, but again, it's edited and structured to follow the history of the character. So you have a lot of really big names in terms of the Bond realm, but then they also sprinkle in and pepper in, shall I say, some other big names in the entertainment world, and then occasionally some critics, and you'll see some PhD names as well, and then some other notable people in the industry today sort of commenting on the series at large. And again, it's edited to follow in, so you have a little bit about the start of things and Fleming, and then you get into the official films and getting it off the ground, and then you run through the Connery era, you run into On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and it goes on into the 70s and the 80s. And since this was published in 2020, it goes pretty much all the way up to really still where we are now, before the release of No Time to Die. So again, it's like this the whole time. There are no pictures or anything, but if you haven't read any of these books or books of this type, when it's your particular subject, they are impossible to put down. And what was most rewarding for me is getting the extra insight from studio personnel, particularly the guys at MGM UA in the 90s during the Brosnan era, getting more inside information about the process of making and developing those films, but also the additional material from the Bond legends, who are unfortunately no longer with us, but getting them talking about the films in the series in much more uncensored, off-the-cuff terms. And so this means these are just like my beloved Criterion Laserdisc commentaries for the initial 3 films that, of course, were also similarly off-the-cuff and unedited. So that notion of this being the uncensored and unauthorized history comes into play, because these again are totally off the cuff and with no filtering, and very honest. And it's most rewarding hearing the legendary names talk about things that maybe didn't quite work as well as they would have hoped, and things they would have liked to have done differently. And occasionally they might be quoted as talking about some of the later films and how they feel about them. So that is what really makes this book absolutely essential. But you're getting the whole history from the horse's mouth distilled down into one book. This is absolutely indispensable, and it belongs in every Bond fan's bookshelf. And again, once you start, you cannot put this thing down. You really can't. Even if you're like me and you've heard some of this material or a good deal before, this goes into much extra detail because it's not cut down into a documentary piece. Next, we move to Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, the unofficial James Bond film companion by Alan Barnes and Marcus Hearn. This is actually the later updated second edition, which goes all the way through The World Is Not Enough. I believe the previous version only went through Tomorrow Never Dies. I just only stumbled across this recently. I'd heard of it and then kind of forgotten about it. And of course, Marcus Hearn is very famous for all of his work on various documentaries and books about the classic Hammer horror films. So I found this volume for very, very cheaply in a local bookstore, and as always with any Bond book, I usually pick it up just for the stills and in the hope that there might be some interesting parts of the text. And at first glance, this seems like it's just going to be yet another book detailing the series with some critical anecdotes and things. But I noticed the stills being used were, quite much more on the vintage promotional side of things and actual on-set stills, which of course immediately tickles my fancy much more than the same stills we've seen 1,000 times. And the actual paper stock for the entire book is done on very nice high gloss paper. But then, of course, it being Marcus Hearn involved, what's best about this is the text is really well done. Each film gets its own chapter, and they actually get into production factoids and talking about not just who did what, but of course getting into the nitty gritty of things. Talking about how the Broccoli Saltzman partnership really started to fissure very early on, leading to their eventual split post The Man with the Golden Gun. But of course, talking about the increasing success of the films as they go along. There's a chapter, of course, on the iconic Casino Royale 1967 spoof, just as there is on Never Say Never Again. And then each film is concluded with a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek, loose ranking of various classic Bond elements. What I do appreciate is each film is given an even-handed tribute, and they go into the basic plot details. Again, not really too much different from what most Bond books are going to be doing, but this one I really appreciate that they go much more into a critical analysis of production as well. They do give their sort of overall feeling on the film by the end. Of course, I don't agree with all of them, but they are well worded and very well thought out. This is really an underdog in the world of James Bond film companions and James Bond making of books. It is really well done. It is very concise. One wishes they could have gone on for more than the text allotted and the small chapter per film, but it is a worthy read. Most of this stuff is going to be covered in other books. If you read Some Kind of Hero, that's pretty much got everything all in one place. But a lot of that information is in here. This is another one of the books that I wish I had much earlier in my life. And of course, this also made much more sense when the internet was not so prevalent, and you couldn't simply just look things up on your cell phone when you were curious to know about something, and then find rumors or a forum reposting, somebody talking about extremely obscure factoids or what the screenwriter thought or so on and so forth. So again, a really well done volume. Definitely pick it up if you stumble across it. It is very uncommon, and this is apparently the British printing because it's got, of course, the price in British pounds on there. I've never seen a physical copy before. I've heard of this, so this was just a must grab when I found it locally at all places in a local bookshop, and really, really well done. It takes a lot for me to say that about yet another James Bond book, because again, most, whether it's critical theory or a fan book or again, sort of film companion volume, it takes a lot for me to actually have positive words to say about it, because I've read so many, and the vast majority just regurgitate the same information over and over. So extremely well done, and again, the stills in here are exceptional, and they are on this really fantastic glossy paper, and some get the full 2-page spread. So here you get the iconic Tomorrow Never Dies motorcycle jump in midair. Next up is another coffee table book entitled The Art of Bond, with the text written by the great Laurent Bouzereau, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I never know how you pronounce his name, who is, of course, the maker of many dozens and hundreds of making of documentaries released on home video and other media. So it's an interesting, another coffee table book of making of material with a nice still from the Diamonds Are Forever title sequence on the front. So it is definitely an art book with, great images here on the front, and the front text information and quotes. You have the iconic, sadly unused Timothy Dalton image that was developed for the original License Revoked campaign before the film was retitled. But it goes through chronologically in the series, and the best stuff is the vintage material and the various images from the construction, the sets, and the on-set material, the pre-production materials especially are really rewarding. And the text is pretty good, but again, this is just more of a beautiful coffee table book display piece. Here you get a shot from the Trattoria Broccoli, the iconic oft-told anecdote where when the food went bad on the set of The Spy Who Loved Me in the middle of nowhere in Egypt, they actually rallied behind Cubby Broccoli, who wound up getting food for and cooking for the entire crew. So it's a really nice display piece. It's a nice coffee table book of Bond elements to have. Can be quite tricky to find. I got this as a in the bargain book section of Barnes and Noble a number of years ago, which is why it's got a little bit of wear and tear. But it was published in the early to mid 2000s, so this is just after the Craig era started. So that's where it sort of trails off in terms of the actual Bond filmography. Next up is John Burlingame's book on the music of James Bond, another essential book that goes into the most detail we've ever gotten about the actual scores of the film series, with this really nice, very amusing cover where you have the traditional gun barrel with the blood coming down. But of course, if you look closely, the gun barrel is made up of music notes, and then the blood itself is turning into a music waveform. So I absolutely love the design they went with. It's a nice, nicely sized hardcover volume, actually, and it's really sturdy and an extremely enjoyable read. And of course, it becomes another great reference volume to have on the shelf that you're going to go back to innumerable times. So it was published in 2012. And of course starts at the beginning and talks about the various scores for the films. So basically each film gets its own chapter. So you have the early days and a piece on the all the stuff about Monty Norman and his Dr. No score, and of course the recording of the James Bond theme and the credit battle between Norman and John Barry, John Barry's entry into the series, and then again, basically each film gets its own chapter, and it is talking about the film a little bit, but it is the primary focus is without doubt on the score. And what's great is that Burlingame goes into detail about the scoring sessions and the actual recording, and then the implementation into the film, and the various composers, and the sort of shifting status of the composers throughout the series, and of course John Barry's continual returns. And then the last piece is basically about the legacy of the scores for the film series. So, of course, this is the book on the scores. So, the music of James Bond literally is the book to have for fans of the scores. And again, this is the most detailed that we've ever gotten, really, for the James Bond film scores. But of course, if you were to have any one coffee table book on James Bond, it must undoubtedly be this book, James Bond: The Legacy, by John Cork and Bruce Sibley, who are two of the key Bond historians. John Cork, and Sibley together, and the team they built made all of the fantastic, indispensable special features for the official films on DVD and Laserdisc. And then those were carried over onto Blu-ray as well. So all the documentaries and commentaries, for example, were produced by them. And this was published in 2002 to tie into the 40th anniversary and Die Another Day's release. And it is a full-on coffee table art book. But again, the idea is talking about the legacy of the James Bond film series. So the historical context, the films themselves, Fleming and the novels, and this is beautifully put together, and it's also very large in dimensions, so trying to fit all this on camera at one time is rather difficult, but it is beautifully done. The text is fantastic, the images are wonderful, and the printing is absolutely excellent. So this is, without a doubt, the best of the large-scale, large-size coffee table books for Bond, and really essential because the actual context of the series and the history is here in perfect form. So just flipping through to give you an idea, it's really rewarding getting the mixture of production stills and then promotional art. This is one of my favorite shots of George ever. And again, the text is absolutely fantastic. So if there were one large display piece book to get, I think this undoubtedly would have to be the one. The James Bond Archives from Taschen is really great, but very expensive, and the initial versions went out of print very long ago. Even the slimmed down versions have gone out of print, which is why I haven't been able to get one, sadly. But I'm thinking they're probably going to do another one once No Time to Die comes out. And there's the rear. It is rather hefty, so definitely kind of hard to hold around. You might see this particular book in a number of library reference sections. I know I've seen this in some libraries before, but again, in the reference section, because not an easy book to check out or carry around, but definitely worth it. It's been out of print for quite a while, but you can still find copies of this. I don't think they ever made a paperback version. Also, when you slip the jacket off, there's a really nice gold foil printing of the logo into the actual book itself, which I always thought was a nice touch. Next up is a recent book entitled The Lost Adventures of James Bond. This is Mark Edlitz's second book on Bond. The first, The Many Lives of James Bond, got rave reviews, and I've been meaning to get a copy, but this one is specifically dealing with the unmade James Bond projects, particularly the third Timothy Dalton film that we never received, and the various script drafts and various writers who worked on it, the various story elements and ideas that were proposed, along with other things such as some of the unused and unmade Spy Who Loved Me concepts, some fantastic interviews, and then it goes into entire sections on the James Bond Jr. Animated series and the various spin-off books. And those were really fascinating, learning more about those and hearing from the authors of those. Then there's a fantastic section on the comics of James Bond, including the quite detailed history on the never quite translated to English, but quite substantial Chilean James Bond comics, in addition to pieces on the comics from Dark Horse and other publishers. And then there are sections on the Young Bond or tie-in books, such as the infamous Adventures of 003 and a Half, by Artie Mascot, the 1960s officially sanctioned book for young readers, which is a really bizarre read. If you've never read it, it's quite fun for what it is. There's a section on that. And then I was astounded to see that he did an entire section on the A View to a Kill tie-in Find Your Fate books that were done. To tie in again with View to a Kill in 1985, they did a series of Choose Your Own Adventure books, but it was the Find Your Fate series. So you can actually read a James Bond Choose Your Own Adventure book, and I have one of those. They are quite rare to find, but it was amazing to hear about the actual process of making those. What's also fantastic is there are artist renderings of the various stories and elements discussed here. Here you see some beautiful renderings of Timothy Dalton, which really help you get a visual idea of what's being discussed here. Now, the actual book itself, like the construction, this is self-published, and you can get it on Amazon still. But it is very straightforward. If you look at this, it looks like if you made a Word document over into a book form roughly, but don't let the simplicity fool you. The material in here is absolutely first rate. This is getting into stuff that no one has ever gotten into, and again, the fact that we get nice images as well is a great plus. I know the price tag might be a little bit high and a bit daunting to people, and I would say this is much more for the die-hard hardcore Bond fan. That's not to say that more casual fans won't get something out of this, but the details gone into here are really much more designed for the die-hard fan. But I must say, my absolute favorite thing in this book, what made it worth the entire purchase price for me personally, besides all the other great material and the stuff about the Dalton film that wasn't to be, the material here, there's an entire section also where Edlitz goes over and details the 1986 story treatment idea that Richard Maybaum and Michael G. Wilson came up with for the prequel James Bond film. The idea being that when Timothy Dalton or the next actor came in, that they would show how Bond became Bond. It's been an idea that has been talked about, this treatment, but no one's really ever gone into detail. And so it breaks down the entire treatment in here so you can get a glimpse of what that purported treatment would have been like as a film. I personally am glad that they did not go that route. I think it's something that we don't really we've never quite needed exactly. It is definitely maybe a matter of revealing too much and peeking behind the curtain too much, but it is fascinating to see how they would have approached it in the mid to late 1980s, and particularly how the primary screenwriter of the James Bond films was taking a stab at that idea. So this book is indispensable, and it goes into fascinating detail, but also not just about the parts that people are going to be more aware of. So the selling point is that you might learn more about the unmade third Dalton James Bond film, but you're also getting so many other facets of the history of James Bond. And that's something I think that Elitz has done very well in his two books, that it's not just the central thesis basically goes to multiple facets of the world of James Bond and the film series and the books as well. It's not just a particular bent the author is on and a particular focus, because if it was just the Dalton portion of this, it would only be a certain section of this book, and the book would be a lot smaller. So it is definitely a very rewarding read and worth the purchase price. I should also mention this cover has the disappearing figure of Dalton, which looks really great, but most outlets are going to give you a different cover with a PPK on the front. And from what I understand, this cover was an Amazon exclusive for a while. So if you do want this cover, it is going to be kind of harder to make sure that you get this one, but the actual book contents are exactly the same. Next up is a very well-known and beloved title. This is Some Kind of Hero, the remarkable story of the James Bond films by Matthew Field and A.J. Chowdhury, and I do hope I'm pronouncing that right. George Lazenby did the foreword for this, but this is essentially the best single volume history and detailing of the film series and its legacy and development over time, with this really nice cover that wraps around, and you get this blood red girl silhouette going across them with the gun barrel in the background. It is quite thick, but this is definitely one of those books where you wish it was longer. I could definitely go for a second volume of this because everything contained within is so fantastic. For the diehard fan, I will say, if you're like me and you've heard the commentaries on the DVDs 10,000 times and you've read every book you can get your hands on, a lot of this stuff is not going to be new in terms of information here, but this is basically gathering everything together. This is the book that I read, and I was like, why didn't I have this when I was a kid? Because it would have saved me reading hundreds of James Bond books or articles, because this is basically getting everything together in one place and then adding more details. So for me personally, I admit I'm not the typical audience because my knowledge is already quite vast, not to toot my own horn. So it's not often that I come across a Bond book that has a lot of material that I haven't found somewhere else before. So this does have quite a bit of new information and material, but it is sprinkled in throughout, again, materials you might have already come across other places. But again, this is the single best volume for the history of the film series because it gets everything together in one place. It's beautifully laid out in chronological order, basically giving each film its own chapter, which helps break everything up nicely. And then there's little interims. They cover the Casino Royale 1967 spoof, in addition to Never Say Never Again. There are several still sections peppered throughout the book. And again, it's a reference volume that you're going to have on the shelf. You're always going to want to go back to, and just perfectly put together. And every time you read it, you wish it kept going because you just need more. You need more information. It's not enough. It is a recent volume, so it does go all the way up to the release of Spectre. I don't know. I'm sure they might eventually publish an updated volume covering the films to follow, but it remains really the book on the film series in terms of the one tome to have. So if you don't have any books on the film series, or you're just looking for the one on the films, it is this book, Some Kind of Hero. Next up is For Your Eyes Only, Behind the Scenes of the James Bond Films by David Gianmarco. This is another one of the, at the time, really nice books of anecdotes and information. It has kind of been supplanted, of course, by Some Kind of Hero and other books that came afterwards, but it's a really nice volume to have. And when I did read this, it had a number of anecdotes and stories and information that I just hadn't seen elsewhere or come across before. So even though the majority of it is going to be stuff that the diehard Bond fan has come across before, this does have some exclusive little bits that I thought was very rewarding when I read it the first time. So I was very happy to finally find a copy of it. It is nicely put together with some good stills laid throughout. It's a soft cover edition, but in a sort of it's made to look like a hardcover. The binding is a little bit stiffer, so it holds up very well. And then you have this really nice stills section in the center. So this was printed in 2002, so it basically goes up through the end of the Brosnan tenure. Again, while books like this now, they're not exactly essential, but I do really like being able to go back and look at that sort of time capsule feel of what the film series was regarded as at the particular time. I still have some of my older books that I've held on to for that reason. And also, you get different stills in different books. So sometimes you just hold on to a book for the particular stills. But this one in particular does have a number of really great anecdotes. So it is a great book to have, or a great book to pick up if you stumble across a copy and you don't have some of the other books, or you're just like me and a James Bond completist. And if there's a James Bond book that's any good, you have to have it on your shelf. Next, we have another legend in the world of James Bond reference books. This is Charles Helfenstein's first of 2 volumes on the James Bond films. This is his 2009 book, The Making of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. This is without question another of the handful of truly great James Bond books. If you were to make a list of the 5, let's just say 5 James Bond books on the actual James Bond phenomenon to have, his 2 books would be in those 5, because these books that he has written and compiled and composed are really true reference works for their individual films. And in fact, they're so great that, again, when you read them, you can't put them down. You don't want them to end. You want more. And now that he's done 2, you get that feeling of, okay, when's the Dr. No one coming out? We need one for each film, because these are so they're treasures. They really are. They do have a rather high purchase price. They are usually well over $50. That did keep me from getting my own copies for a while because, again, the price tag was a bit high. These are also soft covers. They are not hard covers. And I don't know if they were entirely self-published. I do wish these had, spiffier editions for the price point. I wish they were hardcover. I wish the printing was a little bit fancier, because when you first get this in your hand, even though it's got a nice weightiness to it, admittedly it does feel a little bit on the cheaper side in terms of the actual printing. But again, don't let that dissuade you, because everything in here is so meticulously researched and put together, and there are so many images and stills that have just never before been seen anywhere, that it just makes you wish that there was a fancier edition of this out there, that there was a very spiffy hardcover edition. But all that aside, again, these are just absolutely incredible. He starts by talking about the background of when Fleming wrote the novel, the historical context of the novel's release in 1963, the political and social landscape of the time, and then how that reacted to the growing success of the film series. And then once that's out of the way, He goes through, and for me, the best part of the entire book, he goes through an incredibly detailed look at the development of the script and the various drafts that Richard Maybaum went through, and how it grew over time, and how it stayed true to the novel, but then made interesting deviations and some things that seem unbelievable, but are natural in the development of any screenplay. And then how slowly over time it went back to going to the actual book material. So there was a natural progress, and it is absolutely breathtaking and amazing for admittedly somebody like me, but any Bond fan, to see the development of On Her Majesty's Secret Service or any of the classic films in the 60s, where there really isn't as much of this material. We are kind of spoiled nowadays with films having all kinds of stuff available or floating around online. So getting stuff and it being in print and having actual confirmation and images and materials documenting this instead of just being rumors or some mention of it online. This is a fantastic work. Again, it's talking about where the Eon series was at the time. And then when you get to actual film production, Helfenstein basically goes through the entire production schedule month by month, and what the first unit was doing, what the second unit was doing, talks about the individual locations, talks about the process shots, talks about the casting process. So basically everything you ever wanted to know about OHMSS plus more. And again, packed with stills that most of which have not been seen before. Again, this is so well done that I wish there was a fancier edition. But that being said, the printing gets the job done and the images do look good. But again, it does make you wish there was a fancier edition, even if it was a bit more expensive. I think it would be well worth it. But again, this is just a real letter of love to the film, to the Bond series. If you love OHMSS like you should, and you have not read this yet, you will not be able to put this down. Somebody will have to pry it out of your hands until you're finished. And then he goes through various foreign press materials, the promotion of the film, a little bit about the soundtrack, and then the overall impact at the box office, the legacy of the film, and then even a little bit on some of its video releases, which it really made the geek in me very happy. And then the last part is again about the film's legacy, which helps you get an idea of the film's place in time. And then I love the final dedications as well. This again, it's a real labor of love, and you can tell it just leaps off the page. So this is a must. This is an absolute must, even though the price tag is a bit high and the printing is a bit simple, and it's a soft cover, not a hardcover. Again, if you haven't read this yet and you love James Bond, you absolutely have to read this. And what makes it all the better is that there was a follow-up volume. So in 2012, we got Helfenstein's The Making of the Living Daylights. Again, in the same style as the OHMSS book, which makes you really wish we could get a book for each of the films, although I know that would be a massive workload. It would be amazing to see if Helfenstein might choose a third film to do a whole book on. This follows the exact same template, style, design, layout as OHMSS, going through the film's place in the Eon series, the lead up to the film, its development, talking about the Fleming source material and how that was adapted into the film as we know it, the scripting process, the post-AVTAC release, and how the series was faring at the time, post-1985, the hiring of Timothy Dalton, the whole Pierce Brosnan casting process, the whole process of trying to cast Bond after Roger Moore's departure, in far more detail than we've really ever gotten before. I knew most of the beats, but I didn't know every last scrap of information, which is pretty much compiled here wonderfully. Just as in OHMSS, you also get some storyboards and some concept work. Again, going into the promotional process, the announcement process, before getting into the beat-by-beat production history of the film, just like in the last volume, and again, packed with all kinds of stills, some we've seen before, some were officially released, most were not. Again, it makes you wish that there was a fancier edition, because this is so well done that you really just want to pour over it. But again, the printing does get the job done. The images do look good, and I don't want this to sound like a really negative criticism, but I will say, when you do read it in person, it's so well done that you just wish there was a fancier edition with very like glossy paper for the images, for example. And then it goes into the release of the film, the promotion, the aftermath. Just like in the previous volume, there's both vintage and modern critical quotes from film critics and historians about the film, which really gives you that nice time capsule versus modern context on how people view the film. And of course, a little bit on the soundtrack and the promotional materials and vintage stills still again, a little bit about the video release as well. So just an absolute companion piece in terms of design. And of course, these are both on specific films that are really not just fan favorites, but OHMSS was the black sheep of the series for a long time, and now it's viewed both critically and by fans as one of the best, if not the best film in the series. And The Living Daylights, I think, at least I hope, will eventually have a similar turnaround. I think it is starting to, because for me, The Living Daylights is the most underrated film in the series, without question. I do think it is a masterpiece, and I wish more people would take a critical, serious look at it and what the aim of the film was, and what Timothy Dalton was trying to achieve, because I do really think he did pull it off, and so did the filmmakers, and it is a masterpiece that really brings back the Fleming sweep of the novels into the film world. And does so beautifully. So I really appreciate that Helfenstein chose specific films to really focus on. OHMSS has had the big, massive turnaround in overall reception, and The Living Daylights deserves that as well. So this is an indispensable book, and along with his OHMSS book, his two books are in if there were 5 essential James Bond books, these are in there. They are worth their weight in gold. Don't let the $50 or $60 price tag hold you back. It did for me for a long time, and I wish it hadn't, because these are incredible. They are, again, a real labor of love, as we say. Next up, by Sally Hibben, is the official James Bond movie book, the 25th anniversary edition, and this is just basically a book done to tie in with the anniversary of the series and the release of the Living Daylights. So it is one of these more, photo collage with a little bit of textbooks and giving you, a basic history of the films at the time, and it's also, again, a nice time capsule to have of how the series was regarded in 1987. But what makes this extra special is you get not just vintage printed stills, but the foreword is written by Cubby Broccoli himself. So you get a little bit of official participation. And this is just nicely done, and the stills are well selected and well printed. And it's just really cool finding vintage books like this, even if the information is not necessarily telling you anything new. I've always liked that sort of time capsule feel to books like this. So each of the films to date gets its own section. And again, I was just very happy to stumble across this, and in nice shape. So this is just another time I found a vintage Bond materials book and just had to pick it up as well. Of course, I have Tim and the gun barrel and the front and end piece of the book. Next up is it's not exactly smaller because it is a thick paperback, but this is another paperback compilation of Bond information entitled The Bond Files by Andy Lane and Paul Simpson. This is a updated and expanded version. This particular paperback came out in 2000, so this will take you all the way up through to and including The World Is Not Enough. But inside, basically, it's broken up into sections. They talk about the novels and short stories. and then they go into the film. So this does take you through almost the end of Raymond Benson's era in terms of discussing the books. And basically, this at times reads like maybe an expanded version of the rough guide to James Bond that I talked about earlier. So if you do find this or stumble across this or find a copy on eBay or something, it's a nice little volume to have to flip through. Next up by Andrew McNess is A Close Look at A View to a Kill. This is another self-published volume that really is an interesting book because, of course, it is taking the positive and defensive standpoint on trying to get people to take A View to a Kill, the film, more seriously and treat it with more respect because it has long been considered it's always one of the punching bags of the film series, to put it bluntly. There's always a handful of films that everybody likes to beat up on, and it seems to rotate around, but it's always Diamonds Are Forever, Man with the Golden Gun, Moonraker, and A View to a Kill. And A View to a Kill is a better film than people give it credit for. There is a great sense of character depth and an emerging darkness within it that really prefaces what we see in the Timothy Dalton era. I do feel it deserves more credit for that. So when this came out in 2015, I immediately picked it up and read it and just loved the fact that someone put a lot of the ideas I've had about the film and put it into book form, so there was finally something to point to besides my crazy babblings that A View to a Kill is a good film, because it is, but it's great to now have a printed volume to be able to point to for reference in that argument that one always finds oneself getting into. It is a pretty slim volume. You can read this in a relatively short time, but it is well put together. It's basically, I mean, it's not an essay, but I think it was originally expanded out of a shorter work that McNex published first. But basically, it's like taking the idea of an essay and defending the film, but expanding upon it, and basically, again, expanding that into several different points of view and thoughts on the film and its legacy. It won't be for everybody because some people just seem to hate the film no matter what. But if you've always found there are things that you like in it, or you want to like the film more, or if you are a fan of A View to a Kill, it is a great read, and it's great to hear someone else really expounding upon a single Bond film from an analysis perspective in an entire book form. Next up is another coffee table art book with text entitled Bond on Bond, Reflections on 50 Years of the James Bond Films, ostensibly written by Roger Moore, who also co-wrote it with Gareth Owen, really. So basically this is a sort of mini history of Bond with a lot of great images in a coffee table style book. This is a nice little hardcover with some good weight to it. But then there are some really great points where Roger just writes little witty asides about whatever the subject is at the time. So you can definitely feel his twinkling eye when you're reading this, which makes it all the more rewarding. So this is one that you kind of just have to have for that reason, even though it is yet another coffee table art book. And outside of the contributions by Roger, it might not tell you anything you didn't know, but it's just a nice piece to have, a cool display piece. Again, the stills are very well printed and nicely chosen. The layout is nice and easy on the eyes, and it's great to have display pieces like this, but the real key is the little witty asides and all the times you can feel Roger Moore's presence while you're reading this. Next up is the James Bond movie posters 007 collection book, written by Tony Normand from Chronicle Books in 2001. So this covers everything up to The World Is Not Enough. There have been other posters books. The 50 Years of Bond posters came out back in 2012, but then quickly went out of print, unfortunately, so I was never able to get a copy. But This particular edition you can find still. It is kind of pricey nowadays because it is getting on up there, but the printing quality on this is excellent. So this is no slouch. If you can't find the later 50 Years of Bond book, this is still my go-to book when I want to look at the posters in book form. And here you have this beautiful alternate foreign presentation of From Russia with Love key art. It is kind of long in terms of dimensions, so it is a coffee table display piece. So again, I'm having to kind of slide it back and forth to get the whole thing on camera. It is a soft cover, which actually is helpful because you're able to better flip through the book. And since the posters are printed so large, some of them go across the spine onto 2 pages. So it is a little bit easier to look at the materials in this being a soft cover and as opposed to being a hardcover book. And here's the spine. Nicely colorful. And here is the rear with some key art from Diamonds Are Forever. Again, bear with me, I'm having to slide this around so you can see the whole thing. When they made coffee table book dimensions, they did not think about trying to show them on camera, that's for sure. There's the beautiful original key art for Octopussy. And again, you see it runs through The World Is Not Enough. So it's a bit of context, and then it launches into a chapter on each of the films. As you can see, because the poster in detail is printed so largely, not only can you get up close and really pore over it, but it does frequently span over 2 pages. The printing quality on this is brilliant, absolutely beautiful, extremely focused. There's no bad printing in this book at all. And the most rewarding part was this was the first time you got to see really high-res versions of a lot of the foreign art, which sometimes can be the equivalent, if not superior, to what we got in the US or the main UK art designs. And then on some, we do have accompanying text that explains it further and details the various artists. And you can also see how the campaign evolved over time, which is really interesting and rewarding. And then how images would get shared. It also includes vintage door posters. These are from door posters from the original premiere. So it's not just posters, it's some postcards as well, some subway posters, and then, of course, lobby posters and various other things. This is another indispensable book. Again, it has been technically supplanted by the later 50 Years of Posters book, but again, since that's long out of print, I do, if people are looking for poster books, I do suggest trying to find a copy of this book by Tony Normand, because it is easier to track down and get you most of the material that was in the 50 Years of Posters book. Next up is 1992's The Incredible World of 007, written by Lee Pfeiffer and Philip Lisa, again with a great introduction by Cubby Broccoli. So this is another book giving you sort of time capsule look at where the series stood in the public eye at the time, and giving you the history of the film series to that point, but again with a number of really great stills, and of course having that Cubby Broccoli introduction is also going to make it a bit priceless for Bond fans. This really was one of the definitive books at the time, and definitely holds up really, really well. The paper stock inside throughout has a nice glossy finish on it, so it is a really handsome volume, even though this has a little bit of wear and tear. But I always wanted to get a copy of this because it had the Cubby Broccoli foreword and, again, some really nice stills. And I remember seeing this in bookstores when I grew up, but I just never got to own a physical copy until the past year or two. And, of course, you get some vintage materials at the time, and I love that they also, if you look very closely, being a fan of the Bond video editions, you see here quite prominently the banned Criterion CAV Special Edition Laserdisc tucked in. Again, there are some really great stills here, and a lot of them are not the commonly republished ones, and the quality is excellent. Again, the whole book is done with a nice photo glossy finish on all the pages, and the text is really well done because, of course, after this point, Lee Pfeiffer would go on to work on many other Bond projects. Especially love this still between Roger and Christopher Lee. And then it's basically broken up into a chapter per film, going in rough chronological order through to License to Kill. And then the ending is basically about the sort of legacy of the series to that point. Next, Lee Pfeiffer returns with Dave Worrell in The Essential Bond. This is another, essentially, history of the series, and basically, actually, this is an updated version. This went through a number of variations for a while. This is still a nice volume to have or to pick up, and goes through much like the previous book, but of course, going up pretty much through the end of the Pierce Brosnan era. This is another book that would serve most fans pretty well in terms of covering most everything in terms of the film series. Michael G. Wilson does the foreword. Some more great stills and very well printed again. This is basically, in a lot of ways, it does update the previous 1992 book that I just went over. But of course, everything in far more detail and with different stills. Then each film gets its own section. Then it ends with bits on the literary Bond. Next up is Alan J. Porter's book, James Bond, History of the Illustrated 007. This particularly focuses on James Bond as seen in the illustrated world in terms of comics, newspaper strips, and other appearances. It's a really well-done volume. It's not talked about as much because it is a very specific book on James Bond, but the world of Bond in the comics and newspaper strips is, without question, the least gone into. I think, along with James Bond in radio. This is from Hermes Press. It's nicely printed, and again with a very stiffer soft cover, so it has sort of a more premium feel, like it's more like a hardcover. The images are beautiful. It is wonderfully printed, and of course the text is absolutely fantastic. So if you ever wanted to know more about James Bond in the illustrated world, this is absolutely the book to pick up. And of course, it also talks about the films as well, where they cross into the illustrated material, and then the various tie-ins that were done, such as the Marvel Comics adaptation of For Your Eyes Only. And then it does talk about some of the other more modern comics, such as the Dark Horse Bond comics. And then there's some nice interview pieces as well. Next, we come to some of the works of Stephen J. Rubin, a longtime James Bond writer and historian. This is his 1981 book entitled The James Bond Films, basically doing a history and detailing of the Bond film series up to this point in 1981. So this covers up to, of course, For Your Eyes Only, and is a great time capsule piece for how the films were regarded at that point in time, and is packed with really great stills. And this basically, he would update several times and then eventually turn the idea into the James Bond Encyclopedia, which is what I grew up with. So it's fascinating to see how this whole project for him kind of started, and his earliest attempts at doing a James Bond book. Again, really fantastic stills. Even though they're all in black and white, I just get a kick out of seeing, again, with that sort of time capsule perspective of how the films were viewed at this point in time. And then, of course, talking about For Your Eyes Only as being the most modern film. Here's a great still and a mention, of course, of the infamous Operation Kid Brother. Shots of some of the model work from The Spy Who Loved Me. And then the ending section's about For Your Eyes Only. Next up is the updated edition for 1983, which adds Octopussy and Never Say Never Again. This is pretty much the same book as what I just showed, but just with a slight updating to add those sections. I believe most of the actual text and everything else up to that point is the same. It's just the last sections will be slightly different, and then we expand upon into the new films for 1983. And here is my childhood Bible, my personal copy that's a bit worse for wear, but all that is from intensive reading over the years. This is the updated version of the James Bond Movie Encyclopedia by Stephen J. Rubin. This is the 1995, I believe it's the second edition, which adds a whole section on GoldenEye. It's done in this nice, easy-to-read softcover edition. It was updated again to run through the end of the Brosnan era, and then just recently this year, he has now published a fully modernized and completely rewritten version to bring us up to the present in 2021. So I would like to check that out simply to see how it is now reading the encyclopedia in 2021. So again, there is, a bit of wear and tear on this, but that is from intensive reading throughout my childhood. And again, this was my childhood Bible. I literally pored over this thing so many times because it literally is an encyclopedia and has wonderful images and great author insight. And of course, this is still from mostly the pre-internet era, so getting this was literally being able to connect to an entirely different world and to fully engage with the films I was already completely enraptured with and would watch incessantly. To have this, it was just incredible. And of course, it also talks about the 1967 Casino Royale and Never Say Never Again as well. Some fantastic stills, and again, even though they're all black and white, they're all really well chosen and different from what we got in the previous books. And then the other editions of the encyclopedia do have different images, even though the text is the same. But the later editions, this one adds the bit on GoldenEye, and then of course the new edition runs up through 2021. But again, if I'm not mistaken, the new edition is completely rewritten from the ground up. So if you do want to get this and you haven't read an edition of this before, the new edition should be, again, completely updated and rewritten, whereas these older ones basically just, for lack of a better term, they tack on the extra sections onto the end. So, of course, here we have the section on GoldenEye and its materials tacked onto the end of the encyclopedia as it was originally published. So I can't say enough about this particular book. It just, I have so many memories of this. I've pored over it more times than I could ever begin to count. And again, especially for being in the pre-internet era, this was the book. It was the tome for the James Bond films. Next up are two books by Robert Sellers, two essential books. His first being The Battle for Bond, which is about the entire story of the real saga of the Thunderball property, its development as an abandoned film treatment with Kevin McClory, Jack Whittingham, and Ian Fleming. Fleming writing the novel Thunderball, the legal battle, McClory getting the rights to the story Inspector, the making of the 1965 Eon film, then McClory retaining the rights and coming back 10 years later in his many different attempts at making a project based on the rights, and then, of course, Never Say Never Again, and the aftermath. This really goes into detail about the whole situation with McClory and the Thunderball story. It is a saga. A lot of us, knew about it and knew most of the details, but this book, what Robert Sellers did, it is indispensable, and it goes into just such incredible detail that we had just never even glimpsed or dreamed of before. And it really is a saga. I mean, that's not saying anything lightly. It is a saga. The story is extremely convoluted, ever fascinating. Unfortunately, when they published it the first time, it included some materials that were deemed, not suitable for the public, or that were desired to not be released. So that version was recalled, which is why on the front it says, the book they tried to ban. This is the second version, which is otherwise exactly the same. It just has those materials taken out. I believe it was in the photo section, if I'm not mistaken. But unfortunately, this is now out of print. So this copy is very worn. It was one of those books I bought it on eBay, and it was advertised as being very good, and of course turned out it wasn't. I went ahead and kept it because I couldn't find another copy, and it's now completely out of print, it seems. So it does go for quite an amount. But if you can find a copy of this, please do yourself a favor and get it. No one has ever gone in to the story of Thunderball to this degree. This is the definitive retelling of the story of how Fleming tried to make the first James Bond film adaptation, and it just didn't really work. And it was a long, laborious process that ultimately didn't really go much of anywhere, and it wound up turning into a nightmare for many different people that lasted for decades. The story finally ended with McClory's death many, many, many decades later, and then the legal wrangles still kept going for a little while longer while Eon settled with his heirs. So it's a fascinating story. It's an integral part of the Bond history, and this book really tells it in a way that no one else ever has before or since. Now, on a similar line, Sellers just more recently published this book, When Harry Met Cubby, about the two producers of Eon, Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman. And this goes into the details of their relationship in a lot of ways that some other books and studies haven't exactly. It's basically a mini biography of each of the two men, and then how they came together, their history in the film industry, and then how they managed to work with each other for a period of time before the partnership eventually started to fracture very deeply, to the point of their eventual split and Harry Saltzman selling his shares to United Artists, which forever tied the Bond films to a studio entity. This is, again, a wonderfully put together volume, just like Battle for Bond. It is essential for fans of the series to understand more about its producers, who are not discussed as often as they should be, and in particular for Harry Saltzman, whose role, because it ended in 1974 or 75, really, it's kind of been definitely downplayed more, especially in the mass media, because he wasn't around after 1975, and his role is absolutely integral and essential to understanding the Bond films and the magical recipe of the James Bond formula. His contributions are so important and often get overlooked because primarily, he wasn't around, after that point, after the split in 1975. So it was really rewarding to finally get more details of their working relationships, and the biography portions were really interesting and getting into some more detail that isn't covered as much. So it makes another essential Bond volume written by Robert Sellers. And of course, I had to have DK's Secret World of 007, published in 2002, done in their visual encyclopedia style. So it's a nice hardcover with beautiful images from the films and of various props. So if you've ever seen one of their visual dictionaries, this is exactly the same style, layout, and design. So it is sort of like a coffee table book. It is sort of like a DK book for kids. It's a mixture of things, but it's a really nice volume, even though it's not really going to tell you anything you don't know by this point. But again, as you see, really nice close-up photos of props from the series, nice stills, and little bits of text, along with some artist renderings and sort of cartoonish drawings to better detail locations, locales. Each film gets its own little section. Here's a whole close-up portion on Little Nelly itself. And it basically runs up through the end of the Brosnan era. But here you see really fascinating internal workings of a conceptual artist trying to design imagery to explain, for example, how the internals of the Stinger missile launcher and the front of the Aston Martin V8 and the Living Daylights actually work, or how the laser tire slasher works, which is just a fascinating idea for a book. I do have a couple of Bond magazines. This is the Starlog issue from 82-83, where it's talking about the Battle of the Bonds coming up between Octopussy and Never Say Never Again at the box office. But what makes this absolutely essential, outside of being a vintage Starlog issue, is the fact that there is a fantastic Richard Maybaum interview here, which goes into really great detail. And Maybaum was not often interviewed, so the fact that he is, very candid and very upfront and hearing, again, straight from the horse's mouth makes this indispensable. And this has been quoted in a number of books, and I believe even some kind of hero quotes a few little things from this. Because, again, it wasn't often that Maybaum did really extensive interviews, and it is pretty extensive, so it picks up later in the magazine as well. But that's why I wanted to get this primarily because of the Maybaum interview. But it's also a great context of the times, because you get the opinions of, okay, which one is going to win? Connery's coming back. It's going to be great. We're going to have two Bond films at the same time. And again, building up to that sort of press-built Battle of the Bonds idea in the summer of 1983. Then later I found the collector's magazine for GoldenEye. This is the press release type thing you would find in grocery stores or magazine aisles at the time of the film's release. They don't really do this as much anymore, but they did apparently do it for at least two of the Brosnan films. So I have this one for GoldenEye, which is really cool because, again, it's a time capsule for the film's release in 1995 and the hype that was building up. It's got a lot of great stills. It does have some nice articles on the production and some interview pieces. So if you're a fan of GoldenEye, this is a really nice piece to have because, of course, you get all that fun hype for the film, because I'm sure this would have been released just before the film came out in 95. And, of course, some vintage ads, and, of course, have to plug the iconic MGM UA James Bond Collection VHS tapes, and, of course, available at Suncoast. Now that gets me very nostalgic. Even advertising the GoldenEye trading cards. Now, I only have the other one for The World Is Not Enough. I assume there's one for Tomorrow Never Dies as well, but I just haven't seen one physically. This one is basically the same idea. Of course, you see the ads for swag that can be purchased, and you're like, man, can I still get a Twine t-shirt? That would be great. I will admit, this one, the actual paper stock, it's more of a card stock. It's not the glossy magazine-type paper of the GoldenEye one. But still, lots of fantastic images, some really great text, some great vintage interviews, and some production materials and little bits of making-of material really make this great, essential little piece. And also, it does include a fold-out poster, which I will try and show here as best as I can. So, of course, it's giving great production drawings there. But on the reverse, I have to do it this way because it's still attached in here, thankfully. So, you have a great image of Brosnan in gun pose, and then a printing of the US one-sheet art. Lastly are two books relating to Bond in the video game world. This one's really cool because it's the 1983 role-playing handbook for the Victory Games James Bond role-playing series, which is very beloved by collectors and fans of role-playing games and Bond fans. They are quite rare to find in the wild in terms of the actual game materials themselves. I've never gotten the chance to play one of them, but I did find this basic game book once, so I have leafed through this a number of times. And as with a lot of these, they did get artists. They commissioned new artists to do renderings of Bond poses. So of course, this is a new rendering of the Bond and Anya pose from The Spy Who Loved Me one sheet. The spine there. And it is quite thick because this is, as far as I can understand it, this is basically the basic game for the original edition. So this is 1983 and would basically walk you through the setup of the original game before they did the various expansion packs. It's fascinating to read, and of course essential to have if you were to actually try and play the game itself. It basically runs through the entire skill set, the various weapons, vehicles, and then the story elements. And I always find this stuff fascinating, even though it's not really my particular favorite type of game to play, nor do I have the rest of the materials or a bunch of people to actually play through this. But I think it'd be a fun experience to try, at least at some point, to find the rest of the Victory Games Bond material and maybe finally try and play it for myself. And then lastly, I still have my old copy of the Prima official guide for the 2005 From Russia with Love game for PS2, GameCube, and Xbox, with the lovely game version of the original key From Russia with Love Connery art on the red background, the classic Prima spine. Not really necessary, but cool to have, and of course gives you every last hint and tip and trick and ways to try and complete the game to absolutely 100%. I still have fond memories of this game. It is one of the better Bond games, and of course the idea that you're playing as Connery in the realm of the 60s Bond and From Russia with Love story was, absolutely, just waving a flag at me. And of course I actually did literally buy a PlayStation 2 specifically for this game, even though it was at the end of the console's life cycle. That was me saving up a lot and buying this game day of release and playing it to death. Of course they did expand upon the film and make a lot of things to make it a modern video game experience, but just the fact you were playing as Connery's Bond, and Connery came back and voiced the character even though he was significantly older, and you had that humorous mismatch between 60s Bond image and 2005 Connery voice. I still enjoy going back to this game. It was an improvement over Everything or Nothing in terms of graphics and gameplay, but it was still the same base engine. It's still a fun experience. It is still one of the better Bond games because there really aren't that many truly good Bond games out there. I still, again, enjoy going back to this. I still quote this game to a ridiculous degree, especially the Connery-isms like, how do I get to the roof? You'll need this passkey. It's difficult, but not insurmountable. I'll drive. So that does it for this particular video, and again, as I said at the start, it is quite a lot. I've accumulated far more than I ever realized, and of course it all started with this guy right here, which is still my most cherished, and this is really the book that got me started on trying to learn everything about films I possibly could. So this is the book that did it, and of course all courtesy to the great Stephen J. Rubin, who continues to write books and articles and record film commentaries and such. So I have such nostalgia for this particular volume. And again, just to single it out, if you're going to do one book, it currently would be Some Kind of Hero, which distills everything into one book, and so well that you wish it didn't end, and once you start it you can't put it down. I wish they could do a book this length on each of the films, but just essential. I would say this, combined with the Charles Helfenstein books on OHMSS and The Living Daylights, those would be the best places to start for books specifically on the films themselves. And then from there, you can go into the various ones focusing on a particular topic or particular film, or the critical books, or then some of the more film companion pieces or books of lists and so on and so forth. But this whole element of Bond in the printed word, again, it's just something that never gets talked about, never gets covered. There are multiple biographies of Fleming, and outside of Bond circles and on forums, you don't see this stuff discussed, and it is really important. And there's just so many fantastic things out there now in terms of books. The Robert Sellers Battle for Bond is just essential if you could find a copy. So many great books. And so many iconic ones. I still don't have a physical copy of Raymond Benson's Bedside Companion, which is really one of the key books that got everything started in terms of Bond reference books in the 1980s. I'm still nowhere near complete, and there's many critical books and self-published books, and the list just keeps going. So this is just merely a taster, and something to encourage people to check out Bond reference material, because it is a vast amount of books out there now, and just ever growing, and It's something I can't stop returning to. Again, if there's a James Bond book, I have to read it, even if it's terrible, even if it's just a book of lists. I have to read it because there's almost always like one tiny little factoid I've forgotten, or I can glean one little extra thing out of 300 some odd pages, and it's like, yes, I didn't know that. What am I going to do with this? Put it on the shelf. Why not? So as always, thanks ever so much for watching. Definitely keep reading, keep supporting your local independent bookstores where you can, and fitting with this video, as always, keep bonding. Always keep bonding.